and this is Gepwin's Minevlog. I think I actually said it right for once this time. Hello and welcome to 2018, the new year, the arbitrary cutoff date where we decide that our calendar rolls over that is sort of close to the solar switchover of the solstice, but far enough away to be essentially meaningless. That's my pop philosophy for the day. Did you know that calendars are arbitrary and don't actually mean anything? Oh my god. So, I gotta think of things to say now, because this video is out tomorrow and it's already sort of a day later than I wanted it to. Well, I don't know. Like, it's the end of the year. You're supposed to think about things that happened to you during the year, comment on next year, all those things, and I don't know if I want to do that. I had a couple things in mind, but I think the first thing is, everyone wants you to talk about how great the next year is going to be, how optimistic you should be about everything, how the, year in review was, but that kind of presupposes that you feel like you're doing better every year, and I don't know if I feel like I'm doing better this year than I was last year. Last year, the holiday vacation that I took, the family was being horrible. I mean, not as horrible as they have been sometimes, but it was being pretty crummy, so that wasn't very fun. Coming back from a super stressful vacation, when you're supposed to be on vacation, it's not very fun. Had some drama with the YouTubes that, I'm not going to go into. People don't know what happened there. Only just barely kind of got out of my slump and feel like I'm back to doing stuff. And I had a pretty darn crummy shrink for a while. Like, I started therapy this year. I was feeling somewhat optimistic about that. Like, oh, I'm, finally doing something about my issues. And mine wasn't that bad, but she definitely was not helping at all. She was using a weird mix of approaches that I did not like, and I couldn't seem to get across to her that I wasn't liking them. And every time I tried to mention it and improve things, she would act like she understood, and then wouldn't really do anything to change it and wouldn't really bring it up again. So I had to drop her, unfortunately, and I'm half looking for another one. But here's some general advice for anyone looking for therapists, because I spent like the last year either going to therapists or looking for therapists. Do a little research before, but don't do research on therapists. Do research on therapy approaches. At least in the US, it's very difficult to find like reviews or anything of therapists themselves. I don't even know how one would go about that kind of thing. But you can sort of look at their description to figure out what kind of approaches they favor and use. So if you look at the approaches that sound good to you or don't sound good to you, you don't need to know that much about them. Just look up some general stuff. Like, the one that's really popular now is cognitive behavioral therapy, which is CBT, the abbreviation most of the time. And I'm not a big fan of that one. I don't feel like it works for me. A lot of it is about kind of convincing yourself that everything's okay. This is a massive oversimplification, and I am mildly negative on cognitive behavioral, but I don't want anyone to feel bad if they've used it and like it. Therapy is a very individual thing, and whatever happens to work for you is the best thing for you. But I didn't like that, and the therapist I was seeing wasn't using that, but she was using parts of it and not other parts of it. Like, she would use things like the inventory, which is a big part of the CBT stuff, of looking through all the things that you feel like are wrong or right in your life, and then challenging assumptions that you might have about how things in your life are going. But she didn't really do any of the other stuff. Like, you're supposed to have worksheets and homework, and every time you think a bad thing about yourself, make a mark on it, write it down, and then later you can come back to it and go, was that actually true? I don't know. That's kind of the stuff that I don't like, but this isn't the stuff that she did. It was such a weird mix of approaches that it really wound up being absolutely nothing. So what I'm looking into now, I did some reading. You should look up specific reading on whatever problem you feel you have. So for me, that was books on trauma and childhood experiences. which are getting more into vogue now. You could look up the ACE, which is Adverse Childhood Experiencing. So you can look at your ACE score, and that tells you kind of how traumatized you were as a child. Even like people who had decent childhoods, there's some just random things on there, like, you know, a parent died, you grew up without enough money, which would affect anyone badly. You know, you lived in a bad neighborhood, and just things like that. And they've been doing research that affects your life way more than they used to think. But you can look at that. There was this like overview book on trauma that I'm blanking on the name of right now, but that talked about a lot of different therapies that you can do for trauma. A lot of it was talking about single event trauma, which is like what classic PTSD is, like a bad thing happened to you and it affected you very negatively, and they are finding some new approaches for that, and then some of it crosses over into more the thing that I'm trying to deal with, and I think a lot of other people are trying to deal with, which is the kind of abuse long-term trauma thing, which they haven't gotten to the DSM yet, but they're kind of calling it complex PTSD, which isn't official yet, but it looks like it's gaining enough ground that it might be in the next version whenever they put out the new DSM list of things that can be wrong with you. So that was all a long-winded explanation of like, after reading that, there were a couple of trauma therapies that sounded better to me. There was one that was called, like, I'm going to butcher this name, Somatic Experiencing, which is all about during a trauma event, your body was trying to complete a task that it couldn't. So figuring out what that is and being able to kind of like deal with that and move through it will help you unblock some of the things that became blocked off during your trauma event. And the other one, which I'm really like, and I'm kind of like half seeing someone for, it's a weird thing with that, but the other one is the IFS, which is Internal Family IFS. Yeah, that's what I said, right? I can't remember. Anyway, Internal Family Systems, which kind of presupposes this idea that I do kind of like, that human psyches are not in fact made up solely of individuals. Basically, it's like, you know, when you talk to yourself, who are you talking to? Well, that's another part of your psyche, and you should treat them as you would any other person. Treat them with respect and kindness, and be nice to them. And there's this whole thing of like, I'm going to oversimplify this massively in purposes of an explanation, but basically you have your core self, or you, which is called the self in this model, and it can't really feel what we would consider negative emotions. It can't really be angry, it can't be upset at things. All it can really feel is curiosity, kindness, and compassion, and some other things. It's like 3 or 4 C's that it can do. Someone else was explaining this to me, so I apologize if this sounds a little muddled. All those other things are different parts of you that come in, and all of those are in service of protecting you and yourself. So every time that you feel angry or upset or sad or something, it's one part of you that is trying to do something beneficial for you. It feels like you're in a bad situation, it feels like something's going wrong for you, and it feels like this is the best way to help you deal with it. And often that works fine. In the cases of like PTSD and other trauma things, they've gotten an idea that's maybe not quite true. So like, or am no longer applicable. So like in the trauma situation, you had to be very, very scared of what was happening because your life was in danger. But now your life's no longer in danger, but this still feels like if you're in a negative situation, it should still be very scared, because that's how it protects you. And you have to go through some stuff. I'm not going to try to tell you how to deal with it because I'll get it wrong, and I don't want to give people bad psychological advice, but you basically can talk to the other parts of yourself and, you know, help them all figure out how to work together and be a more kind of harmonious whole that's actually working in service of protecting everyone and being nice to every part of yourself, instead of being a little bit off from what the situation would actually call for, which in a lot of the research is kind of what PTSD and other trauma things are, is you are trying to have responses that are appropriate for a worse situation than you're in. So that is my rant on psychological stuff. So anyway, if you do research on the kind of psychological approaches and things that you like, and then try to find people who practice those. And I know it gets very complicated with insurance and other things and whatever. I don't even know how this works in other countries. And in the United States, almost no psychologist takes insurance. I don't know how it works with places that have single-payer health care, or how it would work if we ever got our health care worked out. That's a whole different thing. Let's see. I'm not sure how long that one took. How long was that rant? 10 minutes. 10-minute rant. Oh. Anyway, there were a couple other little things that I wanted to rant about, just from the week in general. Because like I said, New Year's is an arbitrary, weird thing I'm trying not to think about too much, because being in a worse place at the end of the year is not fun. I'm hoping just to keep doing my things, keep improving what I'm doing, and keep going with other stuff this year. But there were kind of two things, and one of them was an internet idea. So I've been listening to a bunch of random news shows and things on the radio. I have the radio on a lot while I'm working, to news stations. And so the thing with that is they've been playing this kind of speech, or they play this stuff over and over and over, where basically they keep saying that the problem with society today is social media and Facebook and all these things. It's very in right now to be like, social media lets everyone be in their little echo chamber and only talk to people who are close to them, and just like echo their viewpoints back to themselves, and it makes everyone more divided, and yada da da da. And I was thinking about this idea, and somebody in one of the interviews actually had the same point that I was kind of yelling at the radio, which is always kind of interesting. But basically, while I'm not saying that is untrue, a lot of the time you spend online, you're talking to people who are very similar to you, and have similar beliefs to you. The idea that not being online would be any kind of improvement to that is a little bit silly, because especially in the United States, I grew up in a very white, middle-class suburban neighborhood surrounded by very white, middle-class suburban people in the middle of Arizona, which is just a place that's full of middle-class suburban white people who have kind of insulated themselves from the Latino and South American and South and Central American people who have come into Arizona and are setting up their own communities and doing pretty well there. And that just scares. I'm not going to use curse words, but it scares a lot of people where I am from. And so you have incredibly insular communities, and I think that gets worse the more well-off you are as a person. You can just insulate yourself in a community that is only people who look, think, and act exactly the way that you do. So, I didn't actually really start meeting very many people who were not exactly like me until a little bit in college. Not even really college. I had a few friends who had slightly different life experiences than me. I did meet some in high school. That's because I went to a weird, small high school that kind of was in a worse socioeconomic class than I probably would have been going to otherwise, through some just random circumstances. So I did meet some people there. But really, it wasn't until I moved to New York, which is a much larger city than where I was from, that I started meeting a lot more people who were different than I was. So it really depends on which community you are putting yourself in. And even here in New York, there's areas you can go where you're not going to see other people who aren't very much like you. It's a lot harder when you live in a big, densely packed city because everyone is kind of out doing things and around. But that's my own rant on why I think city environments are great, but that's very much each to their own thing. I recognize that I very much enjoy living in dense cities. Other people very much enjoy not doing that, and I'm certainly not going to tell someone who wants to live in the countryside to come live in the city. It's not going to work out. So that's one of my main problems with that idea that, being online is the problem, because we've always had these insular communities. And the thing is that, if you're actually online, it is so much easier if you do want to seek out different experiences, the ones you've had. Being online makes that way, way easier. Because what are you going to do if you're in just your random community? If you see someone who you think might have a different life experience than you, and you run up and go, "Hi, stranger, tell me about your different life experience to me," they're going to think you're crazy. But if you're online, you can go to someone's Twitter, to someone's blog, someone's whatever, and you can just be a passive observer. You don't have to bother them. You don't have to assault them with questions and things. You can just read about the things that they are sharing publicly to the world about how they experience their life. And I think that's great. And there are some places that are set up specifically where people have said, I want to be able to help educate people about what people in my community go through and things like that. I mean, that's something that I'm trying to integrate more of. I want to be a place where people can talk about negative experiences that happen to them and, possibly negative childhood experiences, traumatic experiences. And I find it helpful to talk about those things. I want to give other people a chance to be able to talk about those things, ask me about those things in an environment that's about games and fun stuff. It doesn't all have to be so serious when we're talking about this stuff, but I want to create an environment where you can, and that's something that I've chosen to do online. Not to try to talk myself and my stuff up too much. Obviously, I'm just using it as an example, because if I can use myself as an example, I will choose to, so that I'm not using someone else's experience as an example. That's kind of my thought there. But beside that point, you can go to places where people have chosen to. You can ask me questions about my experiences as, someone who grew up in whatever community or grew up as a different person than you did, and you can understand how other people see the world. And that's way easier to do online than it is out in the world. So I think this idea that, just being online is essentially just insulates you in your little bubble. People do not remember these places or didn't grow up in these waspish middle class, upper middle class communities, or didn't interact with them. I don't know, I went to a high school briefly that was all really fairly well off weird Christian kids. I don't have anything against Christianity in general, but everyone together in one place is very kind of born again, literalists. It's a little off-putting for someone who's an agnostic. And I didn't belong in that community, but being the only off person in that area is very weird, and you don't get to talk to people and interact that much. So even if you're the only person in a different community, you don't really get to interact and learn that much about other people, because it's too off-putting. There's very specific circumstances in which this works out to get out of your bubble. I hate that term, because I don't know, it's this idea that by talking to other people who think like you think everyone in the universe thinks like you, which I think can be true in the most extreme circumstances, but also you are constantly exposed to people with other viewpoints than you. Otherwise, you wouldn't have anything to be angry about online. So anyway, that was my sort of thought on that sort of thing. That was another 10-minute rant, apparently. So I guess I have time for one more little thing, and we're going back to trauma stuff. I'm sorry, end of the year and holiday stuff just makes me think of all these things. I'm hopefully maybe going to have something less depressing to talk about next time, but maybe not, because I've only got a couple weeks before I have to go on a Arizona trip and visit the families. That's gonna be fun. Anyway, I can't stand going back to Arizona anymore. I just can't. It's a weird rant. If anybody lives in Arizona and likes it, good for you. I came from there. I got bored of it. I'm done with that area now. I can't really go back. I hate driving. That's really an impediment to being anywhere except where I live now. Like, big dense city is pretty much the only place you can live in the world where you don't like driving. But anyway, I was talking to some friends about this kind of thing, and there's this kind of thing that you're not allowed to talk about when you are talking about negative experiences that you had, especially long-term ones. So this would be like, negative child experiences, or long-term child abuse, or domestic partner abuse. And just to say, I don't hear that term used, like that term seems to be replacing spousal abuse, which is good, but I still hear some of the other things. But the reason for domestic partner abuse is as a term is because it's not only by people you're married to, which I think is a distinction that some people need to make, especially in the United States, because we have some backward laws regarding some of that, but that's another thing. Anyway, some of the long-term stuff, when a lot of stuff is going bad, or you're in an abusive relationship, anything in that nature, when you're talking about it later, you always need to kind of talk about it like it was this horrible, horrible, worst thing that ever happened in your life. And in many cases, that is true. But that negates the idea that some parts of it weren't as horrible, because they weren't always. And that's just going to be true of a long-term thing. If you were in an abusive place for years and years and years, probably not every single second of that was horrible. Not every single second of that was abusive. And some of it was even them being very nice or something, possibly because they were having a good day, possibly because they were setting you up for further psychological torment later on. It depends on the person. But that's the thing. Some of this is like, that's a problem that you're not allowed to talk about that, because you need to deal with that in your own head. Like, if I think about my abusive relationship, and it's like, well, she wasn't always being mean to me, she wasn't always physically abusive, then, that gets into a thing of people always question whether this stuff is true. That's this kind of the kind of Me Too movement that's going on right now. People come in and will try to question it, like, well, were you really abused? Didn't you do something to deserve this? Maybe you were a gold digger. That's a very popular one amongst some circles. And it's this thing of like, if you do not constantly talk about this experience that happened to you, and only the negative bits, and only like all of it was super negative, people will seize on those things and go, well, see, it wasn't really that bad. And that's a very damaging thing. We need to trust other people's experiences, which gets back to some of the thing I was talking about before, of learning about other people's experiences. You need to trust other people's experiences. You need to trust that if someone says they were in a very negative, damaging relationship for them, that was a very negative, damaging relationship for them, no matter how you saw it, if you knew them at the time, or if you're hearing about it later, no matter how it sounds to you, it was a damaging relationship to them. Maybe they're not telling you everything that happened. Maybe it wasn't even so much what happened as how it happened. Because I've known some people who, like, the things that happened to them, if that was in a normal, loving relationship with a person who really truly cared about them and wanted a good, functional relationship, it would be like a minor misstep. It'd be like, they did something wrong they did something you didn't like, and you dealt with it and came back and everything's okay because you're in a loving, stable relationship. But in the context of someone who does not care about you as much as a person, who is more focused on their own needs in the relationship and furthering their own goals and happiness at the expense of another person, this becomes a thing of, you did something that I did not want you to do, we never dealt with it, and it was considered okay by you because you got what you wanted out of it, and it will happen again in that way. And that's kind of the difference there, because so much of this thing, especially with the long-term abuse, it's not even necessarily the things that happened in themselves. Or just using myself as an example again, because I feel I'm the only, it's the only experience that I'm qualified to talk about in any kind of depth. If I was in a like, if you were in a normal loving relationship, physical abuse wouldn't really happen. So physical abuse is an odd one. But like, if my girlfriend at the time had, yelled at me for something, it would have been kind of normal. Maybe I'd done something to tick her off that I hadn't realized. Maybe just she was in a bad mood that day. But as she yelled at me at the time, we would have, talked about it, figured out what was up, been able to get back to a stable place. But since it wasn't a, normal relationship, since it was an abusive, manipulative, and physically abusive relationship, that's not what happens. Do you yell at you have to feel bad. Or she would yell at me, I would just have to feel bad, figure out what was my fault, and do something to try to atone for that in a very one-sided kind of, everything is my fault and I must do something to correct it sort of way. So, that's the thing. But then if I come back and think about stuff later, it's like, well, you went to California together and did this fun thing, and, nobody yelled or got hitty, and that was maybe kind of a fun time, or this, like, hanging out and doing these first things since it was one of my first relationships. And it's this stuff that, if I think back on it, the whole thing wasn't negative. Not every single minute of the experience was negative. But you shouldn't talk about the stuff that wasn't negative, because then people can come in and go, well, see, wasn't it really not that bad? And I want to be clear, these are not necessarily people who are trying to negate your experiences. These aren't people who necessarily don't believe that something bad happened to you. But a lot of people want to insulate themselves from this kind of thing happening in the world. So if they see a very bad abusive relationship, they would love to believe that it's not that bad, because if it's that bad, then more negative things are happening in the world than you want to think about. And I understand that instinct. And it's easy to fall into and try to go, well, see, it wasn't all bad, because that's supposed to make everyone feel better. It's supposed to make you feel better as the listener, because, oh, see, it wasn't this horrific hell experience that you had. It's okay. But they also feel it's supposed to make you feel better, because, like, maybe you didn't think about it, how it wasn't all bad. See, because that's also a vision of kind of pop psychology and stuff that we get on television. Oh, I just finished watching 6 Feet Under, because it came up on Amazon, and I hadn't seen it, and I heard it was a good show, and my girlfriend and I have been watching that together, and oh my god, I could do like a whole couple hours on that show and the way it deals with mental illness and trauma. Oh my god, it's horrible. A good show, otherwise, not a bad show by any means. It kept me interested all the way through, but just the way it tries to deal with these things is horrible. And I recognize that this is how people want to deal with these things. They want to go like, oh, but did you consider that everything could be okay now? And they want, it's like, oh my god, I didn't think that everything could be okay now. Thank you, Bob. This is Bob in this scenario, apparently. So anyway, that's my long rant about that. I think I've finished up 3 long rants, and we're pushing the half-hour mark, and I always wanted these to be a little under half an hour. So there, I hope that's your New Year's good vibes. Start your New Year's off right. The second day of the year, you can listen to me ramble about psychological abuse for half an hour. At least there was a break in the middle where I talked about how the internet can be a positive place for understanding other people's experiences in my, super liberal, snowflakey way. Yes. Oh, I smacked the mic. I apologize. Anyway, I think that'll do it for now. Upcoming, I have more episodes of this. I'm kind of toying around with the idea of starting like a weekend thing, because I want to keep the Minecraft stuff to the 3 days a week like I've been doing, and 2 days a week when things get really, really busy. I want to try to keep it to that as much as I can. I like trying to be on a schedule. But I'm kind of thinking of maybe throwing in some weekend stuff, and I'm curious, anyone who's listened to this far, what you might think of this. It would be like a long play style thing of just something random. Like, I've been kind of replaying Skies of Arcadia Legends, which is one of my favorite JRPGs. And so it would be something like that. Like, I feel like replaying this really old game, or I found this interesting game. So I'm going to do like maybe a once a week long play for as long as it goes. like on weekends, like some kind of weekend long play thing. It's just some random other thing that I don't edit as much, and it's more laid back for a weekend format. So anyway, anyone who's listened to this far can let me know what you think of that idea. And I might talk about it later and work out some more things as it goes. It probably wouldn't be until next month because I've got my holiday trip coming up and I have to try to work ahead to keep videos coming out during that time. But that's that. Anyway, if you want to talk about anything that I've talked about, you can do it in the comments. I like having conversations down there when people feel like sharing or talking about anything. With these vlog things especially, feel free to comment on whatever you feel like, as long as we keep everything civil. We can maybe have a fun discussion. You can watch the other video that came out yesterday. I should have another one coming out tomorrow, if I can get everything figured out okay. I had to do this like as soon as I woke up after New Year's, which is fun, I can tell you that. So should be a new episode tomorrow. There was an episode yesterday, so you can check those two out if you're interested. You can leave this video a like if you enjoy this format of things and want me to do more, and you can of course always subscribe if you want to see all the things I do, and you can follow me on Twitter for random in-between updates, which I have not been doing as much because holiday stuff has kept me busy, but I'm going to try to get back to that. And I'm sorry it's been a little dry on Twitter. It is something that I use, and actually if you talk to me on Twitter, I'm more likely to see it than some other places. YouTube and Twitter are the places where I check comments and things most often. Okay, so that's the rambly thing. Thank you for sitting here and listening. I hope I've brought some entertainment to your Tuesday at least. I am Gepwin. Thank you for listening. I will see you soon.